Welcome everyone to our fourth webinar of the season, an in-depth look into using Arbotect 20S for protecting elm trees from Dutch elm disease. Thanks for taking the time to attend today. My name is Elsa Cousineau and I lead the Forestry technical support team here at Lallemand Plant Care. So let's dive right into it. We'll start with a brief glimpse into Dutch elm disease's history. Dutch elm disease is believed to have arrived in North America in the late 1920s and was first detected in Canada in Ontario in 1967. And then it was detected in Manitoba in 75 and finally in Saskatchewan in 1981. Alberta is still DED free, despite a few detections, including one a few years ago in Lethbridge, but it has been eradicated every time. To this day, Alberta has the largest disease-free population of American elms in the world. Now, DED isn't actually from Holland, despite its name. It takes its name from the fact that Dutch researchers properly identified the strains of the fungus. Now, the most common way the disease is spread is by elm bark beetles. Spores from the fungus in an infected tree are picked up by the bark beetles and transferred to a healthy tree when the beetles stop by to feed on its twigs. Root grafts, a situation where an elm tree's roots are fused underground with those from a nearby elm, can also transfer the disease as the fungus grows from one tree to another. Now, most elm trees get the disease via the beetles, but knowing that the fungus can grow into nearby elm trees is important when managing properties with multiple elms. It's also important to note that pruning bans are often in effect during the spring and summer in certain provinces, and that any tools used to prune elms should always be sterilized to minimize the risk of spreading the pathogen from tree to tree. Now, the fungus that causes Dutch elm disease is not a blight that lives on the leaves, nor is it a wood decaying organism that consumes the heartwood of the tree. Instead, the fungus lives inside the tree's water conducting tissues, also known as the xylem. Now, a stain on the xylem of an elm tree infected with Dutch elm disease is caused by the tree producing gum-like substances called tyloses in an attempt to stop the spread of the disease within the vascular system. Now, these tyloses are actually what causes the tree to wilt and die as they block the xylem and prevent water transport to the top of the tree. In effect, the fungus stimulates the elm to cause its own demise. So a bit of a sad story. Now, Dutch elm disease is difficult to control, and without proper management, it can wipe out a large population of elms in just a few years. However, with a properly implemented management program, the effects of the disease can be greatly reduced. So an effective Dutch elm disease management program includes 4 parts of control. Firstly, rapid detection and rapid removal of diseased elms. Mostly, we use a tree inventory and a monitoring program. Those are basically the foundation. And early detection and rapid removal can keep mortality just under 2% per year. But without treatment, there is no certainty of which elms will become infected. Secondly, we can disrupt root grafting through a process called trenching. We can also save diseased elms sometimes with a method called tracing. And I won't get into tracing during this webinar, but if you're interested, there are some neat videos on YouTube that go over the process. And lastly, protecting high-value elms with Arbotect 20S. And another part could include controlling the vector, the elm bark beetle, perhaps with the use of a basal bark spray. Now, tree injections are part of an IPM approach to manage tree pests that use cultural, biological, physical, or chemical method. Now, the choice of the method is always made to reduce pest populations to what we call an acceptable level. The aim is also to minimize economic loss and ecological damage from the pest, while choosing a method that will be effective and have a minimal impact on the environment. Now, a tree injection is an application method where a pesticide is injected under the bark in the xylem or the cambial layer. And that pesticide is then translocated into the canopy of the tree so that it can contact the targeted pest. Now, injections are typically used to treat vascular wilt diseases like Dutch elm disease, or some insect pests that feed in the cambial layer, like many flat-headed borers. And because the injection process wounds the tree, injections should only be considered when every other option has been ruled out. Now, there are 2 types of tree injections, macro-infusions and micro-injections. With macro-infusions, we're dealing with incredible volumes of solution, and we infuse that solution at a low pressure, typically around 10 to 20 psi. while with micro-injections, we deal with smaller quantities and we deal with a higher pressure, typically between 40 to 100 psi. Arbotect is a systemic fungicide with a 20% thiabendazole formulation. It's primarily used on American elms and has been around in Canada for a few decades. The formulation has changed a bit. It used to be more concentrated, but it has now settled on 20%. And it's a product that is being used on thousands of elms across the country, including in the city of Toronto, where close to 600 trees are treated on a 3-year cycle with a success rate of over 95%. Now, there are some limitations when it comes to using Arbotect. First, it won't save already infected elms, unfortunately. The product can be used therapeutically, but the tree won't ultimately survive. It will also not protect elms from root graft infections. So if there are diseased elms within proximity of the treatment candidate, let's say within 20 meters or so, 80 feet, trenching is recommended to disrupt potential root grafts from tree to tree. Arbotect offers up to 36-month protection, so it's important to ensure that treated trees are retreated in a timely manner. And just like most pesticides, Arbotect is most effective when used in conjunction with an IPM program. So always make sure to use all the tools available to manage DED in a given area. Now, elms only have 1 year of active xylem. They're what we call ring porous. And this means that the majority of the conductive tissues are located in that last year's growth. And so this is important to consider because we want to make sure that we're treating only once the elms have fully flushed out. And this is typically in early June. And of course, this is region dependent. And so if treatment is done before those leaves are fully flushed, then the tree won't have the necessary vascular tissue to take up the treatment up into the crown. So the way that Arbotect works, the way that it protects elm trees, is it'll inhibit both strains of the DED fungus, so Ophiostoma ulmi and Ophiostoma nova ulmi, by migrating into newly formed sapwood, and this over the course of 3 growing seasons. Arbotect has no effect on the bark beetles, and treatments can be performed from full leaf out to the onset of leaf senescence, which typically happens early to mid-September. In terms of formulation stability, Arbotect carries a 3-year shelf life from date of manufacture for unopened bottles, and partially used bottles should be used within the same year of opening. It's important to always store Arbotect at room temperature and never leave it in a vehicle unless proper signage is affixed. In regards to PPE, Arbotect doesn't have a high toxicity, but because we're dealing with great quantities of volume of solution, it's important to be well protected. So what we're looking for is eye protection, chemical resistant gloves, so any nitrile gloves will work, long sleeve shirts, and long pants or coveralls, and of course a covered shoe or boot. Now Arbotect does have a bit of a sulfuric smell, but no respirator is required. And for more information on toxicity, you can visit our website for Arbotect's latest SDS sheet. Now the injection process for Arbotect is via Macro-Infusion. And so the purpose of Macro-Infusion is to ensure the complete and even coverage of 2 to 4 year old branches, so that if a beetle were to come to feed, the disease can't enter the tree. The Arbotect is in those conductive tissues, and the fungus can't enter. So infusing into the root flare is critical to the success for even and complete distribution, because the meristematic tissues in that root flare allows for lateral movement of the chemical as it's infused. So trunk tissue, if we were to consider injections in the trunk, is hard and rigid. It's highly compartmentalized. And so infusions in the trunk tissue will provide very limited lateral movement of the solution and will result in small portions of the crown receiving a large dose of Arbotect, with other areas receiving none. So this is what it looks like. So a macro-infusion will, like I mentioned before, will rapidly introduce a large volume of solution directly into the tree's vascular system. So the system is set up as follows. Basically, the volume of the solution is stored in a 55-gallon reservoir, like this blue barrel here. And this barrel will feed the pump using the red intake hose, and the solution will then travel through the pump filter and will be pushed through the primary supply tubing via low pressure, typically somewhere between 16 and 18 psi. And what doesn't make it through that primary supply tubing then gets recycled back into the barrel via the clear overflow hose there. So once the solution is in the secondary supply tubing, it will access the tree via 4 to 8 opposing ends. and enter the tree by way of the T's inserted into the root layer. Now these T's make up for the whole circumference of the tree, just like in this picture here. So here's a list of equipment we recommend using for the process. You'll need the Macro-Infusion kit, which we supply, but the rest of the equipment needs to be sourced elsewhere. So the 55-gallon drum to store the solution. You'll also need a graduated cylinder to measure out the Arbotect, cordless drill and high helix drill bits, a trowel and a shovel to dig out the root flare. Alternatively, you could also use an air spade to dig the root flare out. We also want a hard bristle brush to clean off the surface of the roots, a rubber mallet to gently tap the teeth into place, an X-Acto knife to cut your tubing into the right lengths, a power source. We always recommend a 12-volt deep cycle marine battery, and a bottle of muriatic acid to calibrate your water's pH level if need be, and optionally a hand truck. So I mentioned optionally, the hand truck isn't super necessary, but it can be pretty useful to transport most of the equipment pretty efficiently, like what we're seeing in this picture here. So the barrel rests on the hand truck and the pump is zip tied to the top of the handle, while the 12-volt battery rests in the back on the axle of the wheels. So everything can be strapped in using ratchet straps, making transport of the equipment pretty simple. So once we have all the equipment, we're set to find a good candidate for treatment. First, we'll want to inspect the tree for DED symptoms. We're going to be looking for wilted yellow, then brown leaves. These will develop as the fungus grows throughout the xylem tissue, and it's something that's also called flagging. And when we're observing or when we're looking at a potential candidate for treatment, it's also important to inspect adjacent elm trees, so within 20 meters, to ensure that they're not symptomatic and there couldn't be potential root grafts. Next, we'll determine the dosage by measuring the tree's DBH. Now, for single stems, we measure at 1.3 meters off the ground, but for multi-stem trees, we'll measure the DBH at the narrowest point between the root flare and the split. We'll also reduce the dosing rate for trees under 50 centimeters in diameter, or for elms that are missing or sharing canopies by the % of canopy missing. So for example, if 20% of the canopy is missing, we'll reduce the dose rate by 20%. The dosing rate for Arbotect for 36 months or 3 years is 28 milliliters per centimeter of diameter, along with 1.8 liters of water per centimeter. Now, we don't treat trees that are smaller than 25 centimeters in diameter, and we use a half rate of 14 milliliters per centimeter of diameter for any non-American elms. So, for example, a slippery elm or a Scots elm. We then carefully excavate the root flare with a shovel and a trowel. We want to dig down about 6 to 8 inches below ground to access the root flare. And to prevent dulling of the drill bit and any physical obstruction during uptake, it's important to sweep the root flare off, even if it's above ground. So any grit or dirt will dull the blade of the bit and may fall into the hole, causing an obstruction, which will then impact our uptake. Now, when it comes to drilling the injection site, we want to make sure that we're drilling in and out very quickly. We don't want to stay in the hole any longer than necessary, just to avoid cauterizing any tissues. And we're doing this at about a 90-degree angle from the surface of the flare to make sure the tea stays in the hole properly. We also want to make sure that we're checking the color of the wood shavings. So healthy tissue should be a nice pale beige in color. If we've drilled in and the wood shavings are a dark or really pale color and kind of crumbly in texture, we've likely drilled into a rot pocket and we should find a different spot. Now, the drill bits that we want to use are high helix drill bits, 15/64 of an inch, which is kind of the standard for tree injections. Sharp on both sides of the twist so that they cut in as you're going in, but also as you're coming out. And so this will allow for a nice clean cut, which will give you a better uptake and will allow for better wound compartmentalization. Now, these bits should be sanitized in between each trees with some isopropyl alcohol, just to minimize the risk of spreading the disease in between each tree. We then want to insert our tees into the injection sites while making sure that they're not clogged. So during the injection process, we're dealing with a lot of water and dirt. So the tees can easily become clogged with dirt and mud. So to prevent clogged tees, we can check each tee for mud or sawdust before insertion. And we can use just an unfolded paper clip to get rid of whatever's clogging the tees. And once they're inserted, we'll give them a gentle tap with the rubber mallet just to ensure that they're seated properly. As we're installing the tubing harness, we want to make sure that we have equal pressure around the tree so that we get even distribution of the product around the whole tree, around the whole crown. So for most trees, we can do that with two entry points, like we see here in orange, opposite from one another. But for trees over 100 centimeters in diameter, we recommend creating even more secondary tubings from your secondary tubes so that you have 8 entry points, which will make sure that every part of the tree is getting equal amounts of solution. Before each use, we want to make sure that we're checking and or cleaning the pump filter. Clog filter will result in a slower uptake. And when we're doing this, it's important to be careful to not misplace the O-ring. Once that O-ring is lost, air can get into the pump, which will hinder the infusion process. Now, once the filter is cleaned, we'll fill the reservoir with half the water required and pour clean water into that intake tube, that hose with a measuring cup so as to prime the pump. Now, once the hose overflows, we'll place it back into the drum and connect the power source to get the pump going. Now, with clean water in the system, we can play around with the pressure until we get the desired PSI, and then we'll check for leaks and remove air buildup from the harness by pulling a tee or two out and letting the air bubbles run out. Now, once they're out, we'll reinsert the tees and tap them in again with the hammer. Now, it's important to make sure that we're using the right water quality, as Arbotect does not mix well with hard or high pH water. We always want to make sure that we're testing the water source to ensure the Arbotect dissipates properly. So if the Arbotect starts to fall out of solution and it'll kind of take on the appearance of curdled milk, that will tell us that the water is not adequate. So it's really important to use filtered water or city water often works really well. And it's important that we don't use water, for example, directly from a lake, a pond, or a stream. Well water is also often too hard for Arbotect. And so in order to get around that, we can use a small quantity of muriatic acid, hydrochloric acid, to balance out the pH. Now, once we've confirmed that the water is good to go and we don't have any leaks, we'll mix in the Arbotect along with the rest of the water. To protect elms for 3 growing seasons, like I mentioned earlier, we'll use 28 milliliters of Arbotect for every centimeters of diameter. And it's crucial that we don't reduce the amount of water that is required. We can add more water if need be, but it's super important that our solution is not too concentrated for fear of the tree suffering a phytotoxic reaction to the treatment. Now, once all of that is done, all we have to do next is monitor the infusion to ensure uptake goes smoothly and as planned. Now, on average, a decently sized tree, let's say between 50 and 70 centimeters in diameter, can take up the solution within a few hours if the conditions are good. So it's pretty impressive. Now, of course, that uptake time can vary from tree to tree as every situation is unique. But we can kind of hedge our bets a little bit by understanding that uptake is a function of temperature. So warmer temperatures are better. Sunshine or wind, so a nice sunny day with a slight breeze would be ideal. Time of day, so early in the morning is always better. Afternoon infusions can take a long time. And other major factors that affect uptake can include, the overall tree saturation level, unhealthy or poor growth, so trees with a kind of a small unhealthy xylem. And of course, if we're not following the Macro-Infusion protocol, that can hinder the process a little bit. So we're talking about dull drill bits, spinning the drill bit in the hole, which will cauterize the xylem, treating a tree before full leaf flush out, incorrectly placing the tees onto the roof layer. If we have an uneven number of tees or they're not evenly spaced, and tees that are placed in too far, so past the working xylem, or clogged tees, unequal pressure inside the harness, or even poor water quality. So once the tree has taken everything up in the reservoir, we can turn off the pump and let the tree take whatever's left in the harness. Once that's done, we can remove everything, rinse everything off with water, and clean up the site around the tree. Here we can simply put the soil back, or we can mulch if we have some around. Now, there's no need to seal off the injection holes, as the tree will start to compartmentalize those holes right away. So I'll conclude with a reminder that every tree and situation is unique, especially in urban environments, when we might have mature trees that have been growing around cement sidewalks and roads and stone walls. These trees can, of course, still be treated. It just might take a little bit of problem solving and a bit of patience, but should be worth it in the long run. So that brings us to the end of our talk today. If you have any questions at all, call or email us anytime at the email address and phone number on the slide here. And should you wish to add Arbotect to your PHC program, simply send us an email. We'd be happy to get you set up. And now with that, I'd like to thank you for your time today. So thank you so much,